I'm Dr. Jordan B. Peterson. Clean up your damn room. Stand up straight with your shoulders back and listen to the Patrick Coffin Show.
Thank you, Dr. Peterson. We're continuing to drill deep into a very wince-inducing topic, and that is the ongoing sexual abuse crisis in the Catholic Church. We're going to talk about the history and the anatomy of the crisis from an angle you probably have never heard before with the author of a book that came out in 2008. It's called Sacrilege. It was widely ignored and derided then, but it's proven to be, let's just say, prophetic. Lee Podles is here to talk about it on the Patrick Coffin Show. Straight ahead. Welcome to the show. Dr. Lee Podles has over 20 years' experience as a federal investigator. I first learned of him through his book, The Church Impotent, The Feminization of Christianity. He earned his PhD from the University of Virginia, and his 2008 book, Sacrilege, Sexual Abuse in the Catholic Church, has proven to be horrifyingly accurate in its depiction of cover-ups and denials and euphemisms and good old-fashioned corruption. Lee, thanks for joining us. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
I'm sorry you had to write the book. I'm sorry we're in the middle of this. It's just so painful to talk about, especially as a Catholic who loves Jesus Christ, who has a heart for evangelization. It's not easy work, so I thank you for writing the book. You mentioned to me earlier that you'd sent a copy to every sitting bishop in America 10 years ago. And tell people what the response was from the bishops across the country.
Zero, zilch, not even the acknowledgement, much less a thank you.
Now this was, let's see, 5 or 6 years after the Long Lent of 2002. The Archdiocese of Boston blew the story open through the Spotlight crew at the Boston Globe. So you were kind of collecting the data outside the rather narrow lens of Boston, because news media love to focus on one thing and just make it about this simple little bumper sticker thing. But you found that this, again, it's a small minority, but it's so universal. It literally happens everywhere, correct?
That is correct. I've discovered almost every diocese, in fact, every diocese in the United States had incidents of sexual abuse by clergy, some worse than others, or at least known to be worse than others, but it was not confined to Boston by any means.
And it's international. You cover, I grew up in
yes,
yeah,
Ireland, Germany, pretty much all over the world.
I grew up in Halifax, and I remember back in the 80s, around 85, there was the Mount Cashel scandal in Newfoundland. That was an orphanage a facility run by the Christian Brothers. A lot of them were foreign-born Irish, and that was really a horrible case. A lot of Americans don't know about Mount Cashel, but that was sort of the prelude to the Boston press explosion. You cover that as well, the Mount Cashel.
Yes, that was the first big incident that made it into the press.
I understand that some of the perpetrators in the Mount Cashel scandal, these were all predators on young boys. A vast majority were homosexual predators. They would line up and go to confession with Archbishop Alphonsus Penny so as to gain his silence, because they knew he was a faithful bishop and was not going to violate the seal. I wanted to ask you about, going forward, I know you're not a canon lawyer, but I just wanted your opinion on whether there should be strict prohibitions against priests going to confession to their own archbishop for this very reason.
Yes, I don't know canon law. There certainly should be. I know in religious houses that the religious cannot go to confession to their superior for that reason. And I don't know whether, I presume there must not be a similar canon law about bishops, but obviously there should be, because once Penny heard about it, the abuse, he could not act on that knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that must have been just
a very wicked device of the priest to keep him from disciplining them.
And the same would apply to seminarians and rectors for obvious reason. You're dangling the ordination. And isn't this part of the dynamic of Archbishop Uncle Ted McCarrick, that he would hold the successful ordination possibility over the heads of these seminarians while he took advantage of them?
Yes, I don't know whether they went to confession to him. It is a excommunicatable offense to absolve a partner in a sexual crime. But if they went to confession to the rector and other priest at the seminary, the priest could not act on it.
Right. Now, you have some personal experience. I read in your book that it was hard to read, actually, Lee, of your physical abuse as a boy and what the authorities did when you complained. Just give us the compressed version.
Well, I was not exactly a boy. I was a very naive 19-year-old.
Oh, 19. Okay.
I was not a boy. Well, I was very naive, like sort of level of most boys, but grew up a very innocent blue-collar environment.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just one incident, the seminary, and I left literally within hours. But when I told the rector, his response was, "Poor me, why do I have to deal with this?" The very distraught young man in front of him, but he felt sorry for himself. And then I left, within hours, I said. I just transferred to a regular college.
Yeah.
And what surprised me is that the abuser, who was a fellow seminarian, was allowed to continue.
Right.
And that was really, at the time it astonished me. Now I realize either they didn't take it seriously, it was just normal practice, which I suspect is the case, or the rector of the seminary did not report it to the provincial of the order. And my abuser eventually was in and out of seminaries and eventually died of AIDS.
I was actually going back earlier to Calvert, when you were smacked into the next week.
Yes, that was not sexual abuse.
Right,
although
that was physical abuse.
Later I heard from people that Brother James, the abuser, was strongly suspected of sexual abuse. And that what happened then was we had a feud. My class there had a feud with him. He was very stupid, and he had the advanced class. And I'm afraid, being arrogant teenagers, we let him down.
Yeah.
And he did not appreciate this. And I was a special object of his ire. And he just smacked me, knocked my glasses off, knocked my books over, and I walked out of class, and I was expelled. I could have. Nowadays, I go to the police for assault. Then, of course, 50 years ago, it was unheard of.
Mm-hmm. I remember reading the reaction of the book by Michael Rose, Goodbye, Good Men, and I think it was Crisis Magazine sort of attacked the book and undermined his research, saying it's not very, it's not social science data. And then Jason Berry's work with his book, Lead Us Not Into Temptation. And I think what happens within the Catholic journalism sphere, I think it's happening less today, but we don't like the good guys as objects of wrath or criticism. And in this case, the good guy was the founder of the Legionaries of Christ, Father Marcial, who we now know all the allegations were true in spades. It was even worse than people suspected. But of course, the reporter, Jason Berry, or Michael Rose, pointing out the problem, they're the ones who get attacked. It's a curious thing.
Yes, no one wants to admit that the family, whether the individual family or the church, has very serious problems. It's just like a mother turning away from incest. No one wants to be the disruptor. No one wants to break the unity of the church. But Maciel was worse than anyone could have imagined. He was a incestuous child abuser, drug addict. Hardly worse.
Right. Now, the research that you did, and I'll just show the camera, the book, Sacrilege, Sexual Abuse in the Catholic Church, you say that there are rings of these predators, priestly rings. It's a terrifying thought, that dating to about the 1940s, that's when your book more or less covers, we're talking orgies and sacrilegious events, and you say probably murder. What was that?
There were several incidents which I cover in some of my blog post or my website, in which witnesses or accusers were murdered. And the one was up in Wisconsin. The priest murdered a funeral director and his assistant because they had gotten wind that he was an abuser. So he shot them and killed them. And he eventually committed suicide when the police started zeroing in on him. But there are many incidents. I would say I discovered about 25 incidents of actual murder, plus hundreds of cases of wrongful deaths. That is, victims driven to suicide either directly or through drug or alcohol abuse. Father
Andrew Greeley, the sociologist from the Archdiocese of Chicago, at least in one of his writings, alludes to a pedophile ring, like a professional criminal syndicate ring, and that also has tied to murder. I think that you allude to this.
Yes, he never, I don't know where his papers are. He said he put them in a safe place in case he was ever knocked off. But he did indicate that this pedophile ring had also been involved in murder, which is entirely credible, either to silence a victim or a witness.
Well, in some cases, the wages of sin really literally are death.
Yes, and some abusers themselves were killed. Geoghan, most notably, he was killed by a fellow inmate in the maximum security prison he was in, who the inmate himself had been abused as a child and took vengeance on Geoghan.
Yeah, let's pause with on Geoghan just for a moment, Father John Geoghan, because I want to get to Cardinal Law, another perceived good guy that no one wanted to touch in a critical way in public. Who was John Geoghan?
Geoghan was a priest of the Archdiocese of Boston. Time passes, but I guess he was ordained probably 50 years ago now. And he very soon was accused of abusing a child. And instead of coming down like a ton of bricks on him, which they should have done, there was the usual transferring him, sending him for pseudo treatment and stuff. Once it just got worse and worse and worse and worse. If he had been disciplined severely, both by the church and the state, and the initial abuse, the abuse would have stopped and he'd be alive today. But they just let it go on and on and on for decades until he was finally convicted, sent to jail, where he was murdered. Pedophiles don't do well in jail.
No, I imagine they're the lowest on the social totem of prisoners. It's not like a manly crime like armed robbery.
No, even prisoners, even murderers want to have someone to look down upon.
Mm-hmm. Right, that's right. Evil pecking order. Now, we're talking a massive amount of crimes against children. Geoghan is one of the outliers, right? We don't want to say they're all like him, but we're talking, if memory serves, 130 plus victims over the years. Yes.
Well, that may be extreme, but again, these are often not really pedophiles. These are priests who like adolescent boys at or above the age of puberty, but they like that age. So as the boys age out, they zero in on new victims. So they often have dozens of victims if they're allowed to go on over the course of a lifetime. So I don't know what the average is. My guess would be 20, 30, 40 victims for each abuser.
Father Paul Shanley. I think I have the first name correct. Is it Paul Shanley, one of the co-founders of the North American Man-Boy Love Association. This guy was able to go pretty much wherever he wanted. He had a big media platform. He gave conferences here and there, always appeared with his Roman collar, and was given a tremendous amount of cover by Cardinal Law. Who is Paul Shanley?
Paul Shanley was a priest of the Archdiocese of Boston who was, from very early on, I think early 70s maybe, was very involved in the gay scene in Boston. And some of the people, the gay activists at that time, have now admitted this was a mistake. He was not simply gay. He was also involved in abusive relationships with young adult males and also with children. At that time, in the 70s, the gays saw the age of consent as a barrier, that the pederasts were part of the gay liberation movement. Since then, for political or maybe ethical reasons, they broke in, but they were, at that time, pederasty was considered part of gay liberation.
Let's shift. Well, before we go to, I want to mention Father Bruce Ritter, the founder of Covenant House. But when Cardinal Law was finally ejected from Boston, a lot of people were outraged that his punishment, so-called, was living in a palatial domicile in Rome as an archdeacon, sort of an honorific title for one of the most beautiful churches in the world, Saint Maria Major in Rome. What did you think about that punishment? Did it fit the crimes?
No, it wasn't a punishment at all. Although he was not actually the worst. He just got the most publicity. Even in Boston, he was originally horrified by what was going on, but the auxiliary bishops, especially McCormick, explained to him, this is the way we do things. And like many people, he went along. He knew Rome did not want a big upset. There was only one bishop, Darcy, whom they got rid of and transferred him out of state, who was really horrified by the abuse. But Law took the fall for the American hierarchy, basically.
And Darcy was sent to South Bend, where he had to contend with all the goings on at Notre Dame, and McCormick infamously went to New Hampshire, where he himself. What happened to McCormick? What's the end of that story?
Well, he of course covered up for a lot of abuse there. It was said, which is probably true, he was active homosexual and lived with his gay lover in the rectory, entirely credible. He was probably the most corrupt of the bishops there, deeply, deeply corrupt. And again, Law, being a good team player, took the fall for all the bad local bishops there.
Mm-hmm. And I remember reading in your book that the St. Luke's Institute, founded or co-founded by an open homosexual Michael Peterson, Franciscan, who later died of AIDS as well, that one of the lieutenants of McCormick took over, and he himself ended up going to jail for corruption and I think predatory crimes. His name escaped me. I don't know the
details, but yeah, St. Luke's was, again, Peterson was not the best, had his own severe personal problems, to say the least. He died of AIDS, as you said. Mm-hmm. And he was not the person to run a rehab institute for abusive priests. Right. His own personal problems are too great for him to deal with other people's problems.
Yeah. Now, New York City, in the days, it was Rudy Giuliani in Caesar's chair and Cardinal O'Connor in the bishop's chair there in New York. Meanwhile, there was a priest who was praised by President Ronald Reagan, Father Bruce Ritter, who also had a terrible end. Bruce that's sort of a telegraphing gay code, isn't it?
Yes, he was, I believe, a Franciscan, and he took the religious name of Bruce, a highly unusual name. And I don't know if it's still done, but I remember Bruce was a sort of a stereotypical gay name. I'm sorry, I pity people who are named Bruce, but mm-hmm. It's there's a line from the. I know it's a real play or not. Bruce, now I know gay is good. So this was a signal about his sexual identity. And he founded Covenant House. And again, like many people, like many men, he compartmentalized. He did some really good work. He had some really grungy experiences. He was dealing with addicts and runaway kids. And he really did help them, except for the ones he liked sexually. And they had to sleep with him. And he did all sorts of bad and illegal things, like stealing people's identities to cover up his lover's background. And he was disgraced eventually. The New York Times was very easy on him. The New York Post went after him tooth and nail. And Covenant House was, I guess, fading off the scene now. But again, it's odd because he did such good work, really good, but was such a bad man in some part of his life.
In Dallas, one of the outliers, I don't want to keep going to the extreme outliers, but I think the fact that they were not handled well and so much damage was done, I wanted to bring up Rudy Kos, K-O-S, of Dallas, another infamous blot on the church's reputation with respect to dealing with the crisis. Who was Rudy Kos?
Rudy Kos was a priest of the Archdiocese, or the Diocese of Dallas, I believe. And again, he had dozens of victims, and eventually was exposed. But the settlement was, I don't forget, the tens or scores of millions of dollars for all the damage he had done. Mm-hmm, and it's just he was tolerated for many years. The bishop knew what he was doing and transferred him or looked the other way. The bishop failed in his duty.
When you say that the auxiliaries of Boston sort of prevailed upon Cardinal Law to not do anything and to do it their way because Rome didn't want an upset, we're now entering into territory that's going to make a lot of my viewers and listeners uncomfortable, and that is the record of John Paul II in so-called cracking down. At least one massive fraud. You mentioned the founder of the Legionaries of Christ, Father Maciel, seemed to have bamboozled a saint. Maciel was given cover by a letter that John Paul II wrote in which he described Maciel as an efficacious guide to youth. As John Paul II was fading in his physical strength was fading, he was basically slowly dying in public. How do you assess what happened in the last decade of his life regarding criminal response?
Yes. Even before then, he refused to act on or even pay attention to serious allegations of abuse. He was given a dossier written in Polish by an American cardinal, so there was no question of his understanding it, and nothing happened. He received numerous reports about Maciel. Nothing happened. I happen to know Cardinal Schönborn a little bit, and another incident was Cardinal Grohr of Vienna, who was deposed, and because of he had abused every seminary in his seminary he had come in contact with. Every seminarian was abused, and after he was removed for abuse, John Paul received him socially on the very consistory in which Schönborn was made a cardinal, and Schönborn was horrified. And he told me he asked John Paul. He sat across the table from John Paul and said, "Why don't you act?" And he wouldn't answer. There was something wrong there. I don't know what was wrong with him, but John Paul failed in a serious part of his duty as a governor of the church, namely to discipline abusive priests and to protect innocent children.
Was Pope Benedict XVI of a different stripe? He seemed to have acted more when he was in Munich, and then, of course, as the CDF, Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith prefect. Pope Benedict seems to have had more tooth in his lion's mouth, so to speak.
Yes, well, his record in Munich is not perfect, but when he went to this Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, he started receiving reports about Maciel. But Maciel was protected by other people in the Vatican, namely Viganò, who got little $100,000 mass stipends from Maciel, 100,000 euros, I'm sorry, mass stipends from Maciel. And there was a lot of usual Vatican skullduggery, forged letters, things like that. But as soon as Benedict or Ben Ratzinger was able to act, he disciplined Maciel. He didn't have a trial because Maciel was so old, he would have died before the end of the trial, and there was no that. But then Benedict began the most serious discipline of abusive priests in centuries, and he tried as much as he could. I don't know why he didn't know more. He was not a force of personality. He was not a good administrator, and he knew it, and that's why he resigned. So but he did more than any other pope in recent centuries, and there's been a lot of backsliding under Francis.
Let's segue to Pope Francis, and I wanted to ask you about the Archbishop Viganò letter. Did you read the first 11-pager and the second 2 or 3-pager?
Yes, I did. Now, no one's disputed his facts. Now, he talks about motivations and things like that, which are harder to prove or disprove. He may or may not be right about that. But no one's disputed his facts, that there is McCarrick was known in the Vatican as an abuser, that Francis knew about it and didn't care, and used McCarrick as an intimate counselor. He handled the China negotiations. He raised lots and lots of money for the Vatican, and basically Francis did not care that he was an abuser of seminarians.
What's your reaction, Lee, to the statement of Pope Francis on the way back from Dublin regarding the allegations in the letter, which are substantial and goes to his leadership, and he actually encouraged him to resign, when the Pope said, "I will not say one word about it"? How did you respond to that news?
Well, let's always talk about transparency and openness and dialogue. Dialogue, as long as people agree with you, I guess, in saying how great you are. As long as you're a flatterer, you're okay. But if you have the slightest criticism, you're now Satan. This is absurd. Francis knows he screwed up, basically, and doesn't want to admit it. This is not a good quality in any person, much less the Pope.
I've noticed that the people having the hissy fits and attacking Archbishop Viganò are the men in the letter and their supporters. And the people who vouch for his character are people like, the sort of stalwart, reliably orthodox, strong bishops. If you're looking at life as I do, like a juror looking at evidence, that tells a lot. about where the truth lies.
Yes, it's pretty clear that no one's disputed the facts, no one's denied the facts that Viganò lists in his letters, but because they know if they deny them, they'll be caught out in a lie. So they decided that silence and attacking the messenger is the best policy.
I've been a fan and a sort of an amateur student of the work of Conrad Bahr's for many years, and I'd like to interview his daughter, Suzanne. I was fascinated by your bringing in Conrad Bahr's his methodology as a psychiatrist, and himself having spent 19 grueling months in the dreaded Buchenwald concentration camp. And one of the points he makes, that you draw this out in your book, is that no one is supplying anger about this. No one seems to hate this iniquity. It's all, well, burble policy, blah, blah, blah. The Holy Spirit has not left the church, and you just got to pray more. Like, what? How do you assess this dearth of just anger?
It's difficult for me to understand because I tend toward the other side. I get too angry sometimes. But Bahr noticed it in the Second World War. He didn't understand why the clergy, Catholic and Protestant, were not angry at the Nazi atrocities. And later on, he saw the same thing, this curious emotional tepidity, I guess you call it, or anger has been as Jesus is the emotion of Jesus most often mentioned in the Gospels is his anger, not his gentleness or compassion or things like that, but his anger, because anger is the energy that God gives us to fight injustice. But fighting injustice disrupts things, and it got Jesus crucified. And bishops are not inclined to suffer the slightest inconvenience, much less be crucified. When I was trying to get one of the bishops here in Baltimore to criticize pro-abortion politicians, the Archbishop's responsibility was, I can't do that. The Baltimore Sun would crucify me. Well, this is not the stuff which martyrs are made, shall we say.
Irony.
He wanted nothing but flattery, nothing but, oh, how great thou art, and he did not want any disruption that would cause him the slightest inconvenience.
One of the things that have always kind of irked me a little bit is the phrase baby bishop school. I mean, talk about an infantilizing way to put your training as a successor of the apostle. And another thing you bring out in the book, Lee's Sacrilege, is the way bishops are trained today in the Catholic Church. It's very much the European, it's all about form and diplomacy and an over-exaggerated sense of tact, an allergy to conflict. Is that feeding the problem? I mean, you can talk about clericalism as a backdrop cover, but the way bishops are trained to be the smooth diplomat and domesticating all conflict seems to be part of the problem.
Yes, they see themselves and are trained to see themselves as unifiers in the church, which is very good. But their unity is not based upon the Holy Spirit, but upon reconciling or at least keeping together competing factions in the church. Some factions which are very wicked, like the abusers. They want to keep the abusers in the church because, these are clergy and they bring the money in, and, they try to calm down the conflict lest these abusers be driven out of the church. And I don't understand it. Well, I do understand it, but I think it's contrary to the role of the bishop. But again, from the Pope on downwards, these are all trained in the diplomatic schools. They're all trained to be unifiers, to reconcilers, not rock the boat. That in fact would be the motto of most bishops. They were honest, don't rock the boat. And this is what the Vatican wants them to do, to keep things calm, don't blot your copybook, don't allow any bad publicity.
Mm-hmm. If in a given population base, 81% of victims were Jews of, let's say, graffiti attacks or what have you, I would call that a crisis of anti-Semitism. If 81% were blacks and the perps were white, I would say that's a crisis involving racism. But editors, when they hear the phrase, maybe they invented it, pedophile priest, it's like catnip. And they keep describing it as a child rapist problem or clericalism, that no one wants to say what it is, that 81% of the victims were post-pubescent or teen boys. That sounds like a homosexual predator crisis to me, in the main. Of course there were female victims, and one victim is too many, of course. So what?
Yes,
Yeah, go ahead.
that's true. That the actual pedophiles, those who were attracted to children below the age of puberty, were a very small minority and actually declining over the past 50 or 60 years. The absolute numbers have declined as far as we can determine. Almost all of the abuse was of, as you said, 80%, and probably more because boys are more reluctant to report. Probably more like 90 to 95% of abuse of pubescent or teenage boys. I wouldn't call this precisely, well, it's a type of homosexuality, it's pederasty.
Yeah.
That priests in the seminary are seduced by older professors or by bishops like McCarrick, and then they go out and they seduce younger men and teenagers. And some of those people enter the seminary, and the culture of pederasty grows up. There's a significant segment of the clergy, there is a culture of pederasty like that in ancient Greece, namely adult men having relations with younger men and teenagers who then grow up and do the same thing. And this is propagated in the seminaries, as we saw in McCarrick's case. And until this is broken, I don't see any real hope for real reform in the church.
Well, it's a literal application of the biblical principle, the sins of the fathers are visited upon the sons to the third and fourth generation. You see this baton of abuse being handed on. It kind of shows the truth of the maxim, hurt people. If you've been groomed and sort of wounded by this, one way to achieve some kind of equilibrium is to repeat it on someone else. So you have your own pool of victims. It's diabolical.
It is, and it's, as I said, it's a male sexuality, of course, as we men know, it's very dangerous. It's problematic. Men are inclined to all sorts of perversities and crimes, and they have to be disciplined. And it's too easy for men to accept basically perverse sexual relationships as the norm. And this has happened within the church. And even the bishops who were not personally involved were not upset by this and accept it as a problem, like maybe drinking too much at a cocktail party. They wish priests wouldn't do it, but they weren't upset by it.
Mm-hmm. Another clinician, ex-priest, who drew the ire of a lot of conservatives was Richard Sipe, may he rest in peace, who endorsed your book. One of the things he did was surmise, based on anecdotal evidence, I don't think he had magical soul-reading apparatus, but he believes that there's a high proportion of homosexual bishops, closeted homosexual bishops, that help explain why when seminary rectors would complain, his boss, the bishop, wouldn't do much because they were either open to blackmail or they were compromised in some other way. Do you find his estimates to be too high or about right?
It's hard to say, again, because it's a secret behavior, but it would explain their failures. He knew personally of many of these abusive bishops because their victims would come to him and complain, but not go public. And he kept telling the victims, it doesn't do any good to tell me, go to the newspapers. But they wouldn't do because they knew that once you expose a bishop as an abuser, no other bishop will ever touch you. That is, your work as a priest is ended. And because no one wants to rock the boat, no one wants bad publicity, no one wants an honest man in the clergy. Everything has to be pretense, everything is okay, everyone's a saint. It's just, it's not honest, it's not healthy.
Now, you give talks around the country, Lee. I want to connect people with you. So let me ask you this, and I'm going to put it in the show notes at patrickcoffin.media. How can people connect with you? What's your website?
The best way to reach me is through my email. I'm having a little trouble with my email on my website. Lee Podles, LeePodles @gmail.com.
Okay.
That's the best way to reach me.
LeePodles @gmail.com. Very good. Now, when you give your testimony, you share the research that's contained in this book. Do you get pushback? Angry people don't want the boat rocked, or what's the general reaction to your presentations at the parish level or conferences?
Well, initially when I was giving presentations and talks, and after the book came out, no one would believe it. They said, "This can't be true. This can't be true." or it's so far in the past it's not happening anymore, and the Pope will take care of it. But now people realize it's not true. I've given more recent talks since the publicity about McCarrick. Mm-hmm. Basically, people are unhappy. I mean, they're sad. They're sad, and not by me, by what is happening in the church. And they wish it weren't happening, but they realize it is. And often victims in the audience come forward and say, I'm right, and they know that they wish people would not close their eyes to this abuse, not enable abusive priests and abusive bishops.
Without giving names, have any bishops kind of come back to you, back channel, thanking you, saying, basically validating what you're doing as accurate?
I can name him. Cardinal Schönborn has thanked me. He read part of my book. He couldn't read a law, but he was concerned. He was a cardinal because of the Cardinal Gore case, and he thanked me for my work and said, alas, it was accurate. In fact, worse than I depicted in the book.
Mm-hmm. Lay people involved in the church as far as cleanup and restoration and purification. I find some clerics, including prelates, give lip service to lay involvement, but they really, down below in the heart, they have more of the pray, pay, and obey mentality, despite the fact that the Second Vatican Council famously trumpeted the universal call to holiness. Well, part of holiness is telling the truth about things and not relying on euphemisms. What do you envision the role of lay people, men and women who are professionals at investigation and administration and doing the right thing?
Well, right now, the only real leverage that the laity has is money. And it's up to the big donors to tell the bishops and the Vatican, until you clean up your act, no more money. That would get immediate action. In the future, I would think there's no particular reason why there cannot be courts staffed by eminent jurists that would hear the cases of bishops, including the Bishop of Rome, and at least, if not pass sentence, at least give the opinion of what should be done. Why do only clerics have to judge clerics? Why can't laymen of good judgment judge clerics? I don't see why not. I also think that seminaries should be staffed almost exclusively by lay people, because the seminarians, the priests, will be ministering to the laity, and who better can tell who's able to minister properly than laity? There's no reason. In fact, it would solve the problem of this intergenerational incest, basically, in the seminary if the staff were almost exclusively lay. So I think there are important roles for laity in the church without compromising the essential structure of episcopal governance. Basically, the bishops want to be absolute monarchs and maybe pretend to listen to lay people, but not really. That just these listening sessions, which the words go in one ear of the bishop and out the other. He's not going to act on them. It's just pretense. It's just PR. There are very few bishops who really want lay. No bishop has ever contacted me. I'm an Orthodox Catholic. I'm a federal investigator. I'm a published author. Not a single bishop has ever asked me, "What do you think?"
That's interesting. It reminds me of Layla Miller's book, Primal Loss. It's 70 stories of adult children of divorce. No one ever asked the children, how did your parents' divorce affect you? The forgotten players in the tragedy. Yes. I remember hearing Cardinal Ouellet, formerly of Quebec, saying that part of the answer has to be more women professors. And my first thought was your book. And I thought, well, not exactly, Your Eminence. We need salient, manly, masculine leaders as models for these young guys. Often they come from families who are divorced or, weak or absent fathers. I'm not against women professors or even heads of seminary, but it seems to me there's a dearth of strong men as models for priests. A priest is supposed to be a father.
Yes, and often they don't have, because of modern society, they don't have good models in their own family. Even Cardinal Schönborn, and he's talked about this publicly, his father deserted his mother. And it's a big problem in the modern world. And as you said, what seminarians need are good, manly models to learn how to behave as a good father to their flock.
There was one figure who recurs in your book, and that's, I believe he was a Paraclete father, Father Jerry Fitzgerald. He seemed to have been a straight-shooting truth teller who would not have fit in with this kind of soft diplomacy modus vivendi. Who was he?
He was a priest who, back in, I think, a long time ago, the 50s maybe, established a center to handle the problems of alcoholic priests. And very soon bishops were sending him abusive priests, sexually abusive priests. And he was so horrified by that, he bought a Caribbean island to put his center on, and the Vatican made him sell it. He established a center in New Mexico, and it had branches, I think, all over the world, actually. And he tried to initially help these abusive priests, but there's very little he could do, it turned out. And then the inmates took over the asylum, and the head of the center in New Mexico was himself an abuser. So it didn't do any good. He was a straight shooter, he was honest, and therefore he was out of favor in the church.
Do you have hope that the right purification is going to come quickly? Because we're still in the roiling mess of this grand jury report from PA. I understand that these grand jury reports are rolling across the country. Part of me says, just burn it down. Go grand jury reports, because the culture of secrecy is so ironclad and the denial is so entrenched. On the other hand, the PA grand jury report drew descriptions of 301 accusations, only 2 indictments. So another way to put that is there were 299 that didn't have enough evidence to go to court, and a lot of these men are dead. So maybe speak a bit to the need to not succumb to moral panic, that descriptions of abuse, whether last Tuesday or decades ago, don't necessarily mean that they were 100% accurate.
Well, no, although a lot of the problem is the statute of limitations. In Maryland, for example, child victims have until the age of 23 to file a criminal complaint. Mm-hmm. Of course, people don't face it until their 40s or 50s. So, a lot of the problems with the grand jury reports is the statute of limitations. Unfortunately, the worst descriptions are often true. The one in Pittsburgh about the sadomasochistic ring, which used chains and whips, was, alas, all too true. I think these reports should force people to face the problem of evil, not simply in the church, but in the world itself, that we are in a spiritual battle, and the forces of evil are profound, and they're eventually run by Satan. The world is not full of nice people. The world is full of people who have divided hearts, some more than others, and that we have to face the fact, as Jordan Peterson has pointed out, and Solzhenitsyn has pointed out, that the line of evil runs between good and evil runs through every human heart, but that we must combat it both in ourselves through spiritual disciplines, and that enables us to see it clearly and combat it in the world, and to protect the weak and the innocent.
So much more to be said. It must be tempting to update your book, but I'm sure you've had enough of that. Yeah, you've been there. Well, your book is it's still relevant, and even though it describes events that were in the news and largely forgotten, I think that the basic principles are there and they're valid. And I thank you for the work, Lee. I know it's been vindicated. I know it's kind of cold comfort, but I appreciate the fact that you're not an ideologue. You're not a loopy liberal with an axe to grind. You're not a bitter, uber traditionalist who hates all popes after 1772. So thank you for writing the book, and I hope it gets what it deserves, which is a wide readership. It's called Sacrilege, Sexual Abuse in the Catholic Church. If you want to have Lee Podles come to your event, his email is leepodles@gmail.com. That's LEEPODLES@gmail.com. Thanks again, Lee. I appreciate your time.
Okay, thanks.
This is The Patrick Coffin Show. Be a saint. What else is there?
Hey, this is Patrick Coffin. If you like what you see and hear and you want to see and hear more, consider joining Coffin Nation as a full member. Just click right here and find out more about what that means. Nipsey, my fedora. That's Coffin Nation, the world's largest online community of culture builders. Click right here. See you on the inside.